Well, for more on Eskom working to end load reduction within that time frame, we're joined by energy expert Ruse, Moleshe and Dr. Trevor Ngwane to speak to us a little bit more about that. Doctor, I think I'd start with you. This has been an ongoing conversation, specifically in some of those communities that experience load reduction the worst. And the minister has admitted that load reduction mostly hits those poorer communities, as he said, creating an appearance of discrimination. Is this an appearance, or is this really a systematic bias in regards to how electricity is supplied to some of these communities?
Thank you for having me, Veronica, and my fellow speaker there. Yeah, I was happy that the minister acknowledged what, in a research project we conducted at UJ 3 years ago, we called energy racism. And more than that, the South African Human Rights Commission set up public hearings early this year in February to inquire into the impact of load reduction on human rights. And indeed, most of the inputs and the findings of our research was that poor working class areas were being discriminated against and targeted by load reduction. So I think the truth has dawned on the minister.
And I think it's quite important when you mention, of course, that when you spoke to the Human Rights Commission, I remember that you spoke about this as energy racism. And in fact, the minister himself in that briefing, acknowledging to some degree that it hits those poorer communities. But he also did reflect on the fact that this is an infrastructure crisis. And Meru, so that's where I'd like to bring you into this conversation. Ending load shedding within that time frame, he made it very clear that that is, of course, up to the cooperation of the community, speaking about that infrastructure crisis in those areas. Why does load reduction differ from load shedding, particularly when it comes to community infrastructure, vandalism, and access to power?
Thank you for the question, and good evening to you and all the viewers. The difference between load shedding and load reduction is that load shedding happens at a macro level when there is not enough supply in the system to meet demand. Now, Eskom has done a lot of work to address the issues of supply, the coal-fired power plants and their maintenance. And we now have a relatively high reliability in that regard. That means we have available electricity. We don't have issues. However, at a local level, the distribution infrastructure can, in some cases, some areas, be overloaded. Mainly, there are two reasons. One could be that new infrastructure has not been put in place. Another reason could be people who are connecting illegally, and therefore there is congestion, and that causes a problem in that system.
And talk to us about the minister's timeline. As you've mentioned, that there are a lot of households that, of course, suffer from this because of the infrastructure challenge. Can Eskom, of course, meet this deadline? How realistic is it from an infrastructure point of view?
Well, it's hard to say with certainty that this deadline can be met. However, there are elements in his plan that show that it can be accelerated. But there's a dependency. If there are areas where he faces resistance, obviously that will take longer. But I like the fact that there was a thorough plan behind it per province and how they will approach the whole solution. For instance, he says in rural areas, they will be able to talk to chiefs, and they think that that might be easier. But there are areas where it might be difficult. Another thing that it may make it realizable quicker is the fact that they are going to use Eskom balance sheet to be able to do it. So they don't have to go and look for funding and do all of that. So I'm in two ways. It can be achievable, but it's subject to how the whole rollout proceeds.
Yeah, and Dr. Trevor, you were part of the team there that explained that the problem with load reduction as well is that it targets every household and not particularly those individuals that are involved, perhaps be it with, tampering with the infrastructure, those that are paying electricity. And you heard from the minister today that smart meters are central to the plan on ending load reduction. But Ruse spoke about it now, that there is, of course, that resistance from the community, specifically as well in Soweto. How are we going to, of course, balance that, those non-paying customers, with trying, of course, to end this once and for all?
Yes, well, the elephant in the room is the affordability of electricity to the people here in South Africa. I mean, the middle class, let alone the working class and the poor, everyone is complaining. So basically, the minister is, let's say, confusing or conflating two goals. One is eliminating load reduction, probably in response to the outcry and the Human Rights Commission. But the second goal is increasing revenue collection. Yeah, so now this is all confusing because one goal will suffer. Maybe they will prioritize revenue collection. And indeed, revenue collection, that is why they're rolling out the prepaid meters, the smart meters. And the real goal there is not eliminating load reduction, is increasing, getting money from the people, extracting rands and cents from, struggling communities economically. So I think that's the major problem. The other problem is that, although I agree with Mrs. Ruse that, it sounds like a good plan, but again, it was made by the minister alone or with a group of consultants. So it's top-down and technocratic. The people have not been involved in putting this together. The people who will be affected by the plan, nothing about us without us. Indeed, when the minister seems to consider the views of the people, he starts talking about expecting resistance. So I wonder, what is resistance? Who defines resistance? If I disagree with the minister on certain specifics, maybe small specifics of his plan, will that community be said to be resisting? And he did say, so it's a punitive approach. He said, if a community resists, then the project will stop, and then that community will be put at the back of the queue. So that's a punitive, already hostile attitude. Whereas I think that the minister, government officials, leaders should be open-minded. I mean, they are not our rulers. They are supposed to be our servants. But I think the attitude is completely wrong. This might be the downfall of this plan.
Sure. I'm very curious to find out about those specifics, but we'll talk a little bit about that when we return from the break. Stay with us. Welcome back. We are continuing one of the top stories of the day. Energy Minister announcing that load reduction will soon come to an end. And we're joined, of course, by our guest. And just before the break, Dr. Trevor, you mentioned, of course, that announcement by the minister as a punitive measure, saying that the minister failed to consider essentially the communities when he put this plan forward. Talk to me a little bit about that and what exactly why exactly would you consider this a punitive approach?
Yes. So remember, the minister is part of the ANC, which is the political party which led our victory over apartheid, the victory of national liberation. So the mandate of the ANC was to roll back, redress past injustices, oppressions, and exploitation. But what happened is that under the new government, the rich continued to get richer. So in a way, the ANC has failed to fulfill its mandate. And secondly, not only has it failed, but the masses are starting to turn against it, as we saw with the loss of parliamentary majority. So this is the most important thing in South Africa, that the people are still expecting to get the results and the fruits, the rewards of their struggle for national liberation against apartheid. Apartheid, by the way, was a form of racial capitalism. It's because of settler colonialism, which predated racial capitalism. So these are the issues, but we see a government, it's worse now. We have a government of national unity. It's the ANC and the DA representing those old racial capitalist colonial interests. So it looks as if, you know, the needs of the masses are going to increasingly and again, you know, to be on the back burner. What we need is massive redistribution, you know, in South Africa, not going back to, you know, old colonial approaches.
Well, I hear you there, Dr. Trevor, in terms of bringing in the issue, of course, of apartheid. But let's go back to the energy expert. Ruse, would you agree that at its core, load reduction, is it a technical problem? Is it an injustice? Is it an issue of inequality?
It's a mix of things. When it comes to load reduction, the theft that we are talking about is not only confined to residential areas. There are commercial users that also do tap illegally into that, and those must pay. Because if you have, for instance, the ESCOM is owed almost 10 billion rand, and that's not a sustainable system. But I agree with him when it comes to the indigent users. Government came up with a policy called free basic electricity that was saying that those who are poor will be allocated about 50 kilowatt hours per month. That has not been implemented properly by government, and that is not okay. And even as I said earlier on, the minister are very eloquent about the plans that will be implemented in terms of the smart meters. However, when it comes to identification of the users that need to benefit from free basic electricity, we still hear that municipalities are not able to identify them. We need an equally eloquent plan with respect to those 2.5 million users that are poor that need to be identified and benefit from this. The allocation is made by National Treasury all the time, but those beneficiaries are not getting it. This would address the issue of identifying, taking away those who are poorer, and then insisting on payments from those who can afford and who should pay, just like everyone else in the country, to make sure that the whole system is sustainable.
And we actually heard the minister as well speaking about that issue of the money that is often allocated to municipalities, saying that, in fact, they use it in oftentimes to pay salaries within, of course, the municipality. And this is affecting residents quite badly. How do we address that issue when it comes to the responsibility that customers have to pay for services, to pay for electricity, but also balance the fact where municipalities are at the same time responsible for the harsh implications that some of those homes feel when there are no lights?
So, yeah, that's like I said earlier on, we need to differentiate between those who can afford and those who cannot. And we need to do what is our responsibility to make sure we properly identify households that really genuinely cannot afford. It's good news that the minister is saying the 50 kilowatt hours will be increased to 200 kilowatt hours, because it was identified at a stage a long time ago. And now with inflation and electricity costs having gone up, that is no longer sufficient. But we need to move urgently with respect to that. And as I said, we need to have equally eloquent plans with respect to how are we going to make sure we identify the indigent households and they benefit from what is supposed to be due to them.
And Dr. Trevor, how much of the accountability does the Soweto Crisis Committee place at the door of municipalities when it comes to the lack of providing free electricity to residents?
Yeah, well, we approach this matter in a holistic manner. You know, it's governance And at one point, you know, the ANC was ruling national, provincial, and most of the local government, and only one province, you know, was out of its hands. So on the one hand, that distinction of the hierarchies of government are important. On the other, you know, they're supposed to work together. And in any case, the top structures are supposed to supervise the lower structure to make them that they work. Also, remember that some of the money coming from the top, which makes local government to be functional, has been systematically reduced, you know, by the treasury. From the day we got our independence, now we heard that each municipality must collect enough revenues to sustain itself. But remember, the topography, economically, the geography was unequal. You know, municipalities in the northern suburbs would obviously have money. Municipalities in the poor rural areas wouldn't have money. As a result, those poorer municipalities started to use electricity, you know, the trading accounts to make money. Hence the price of electricity keep on rising. But yes, councillors, mayors must use the money allocated to provide free basic electricity for that and not use it to increase their salaries.
Yeah, and there are often, criticism as well to some of the residents in the community that perhaps can afford to pay for electricity. And while we speak about the minister's plan to identify some of those that cannot keep up with the cost of electricity, we find that there are those taking advantage of that system. Will the crisis committee also be encouraging residents to pay, specifically those that can afford to pay for electricity?
At the moment, we cannot undertake that mandate because remember, not only do we want affordable, clean, reliable energy for all, but we want it done in a way in which, you know, the environment is not damaged. But now the government, ESCOM, keeps on burning coal. I was happy, you know, on a positive note, to hear the minister talk about the possibility of using solar power to actually, you know, subsidize or make, you know, meet the gap, fill the gap for free basic electricity, although he said only in the rural areas. We need a stronger move to solar power, including in the townships, including even in the richer areas. So those are the things we still want. Also, of course, 200 kilowatt hour per month, although it's an increase, an improvement to the 50, but the 50 was tokenistic. It was very little. I mean, the minister was saying things like, we know times have changed. People are now, you know, using, gadget, laptops, and then saying people have now got TVs. People always have had TVs, you know. So it's not as if things have changed that drastically. That 50 kilowatt hour was very small. I think what would be fair would be 500 kilowatt hour, you know, for the poor. Moreover, the whole point of 50 basic, the free basic energy, it came when we were using the policy of a rising block tariff system, you know, where the more you use, the more you pay. The less you use, the less you pay per unit. But now the government and ESCOM have moved away from that. That old system allowed for cross-subsidization. So the big companies, those who use a lot of electricity, you know, jacuzzis, subsidize those who use less. But that has gone away now. It's almost as if it's everyone for himself or herself. So that's why we can't undertake to support, you know, the campaign to get people to pay.
Ruse, I'd like to bring you into the conversation. We know that some of the implementation of this load reduction has been described as ESCOM as some of those high-density areas. Population growth within specifically the provinces of Gauteng, Mpumalanga, Limpopo, which was identified as a hotspot essentially for this implementation of power sharing, continues to grow if we've got a number of residents who are not willing to comply with the issue of smart meters, what does this mean for the national grid as a whole?
It means that the likelihood of load reduction continuing is higher in those areas because those areas are suffering from load reduction, and some of the users are saying, we are willing to pay, and it's not fair that the system affects all of us. I remember, I don't know whether it was last year, but I know it was here in this, where we had a lady from Alexandra saying, we are willing to pay, some of us, but we are not able to do so because the infrastructure is, we are reduced, all of us, when it comes to overloading or risk of overloading. Remember that infrastructure as well gets affected where you have blow-ups, and that infrastructure has to be replaced, and it's replaced at a cost. So at the end of the day, the cost is not going to go away. You're going to continuously have a problem of infrastructure, of funding, of sustainability, until you address the issue of people who are supposed to paying for electricity, and dealing decisively with those people who are genuinely cannot afford to pay, and urgently, actually, to be able to relieve them from the system. Because part of that, actually, congestion comes from some of those indigent households that genuinely are not able to pay. So you have to differentiate.
All right. Well, it is clearly a balancing act between fixing infrastructure and, of course, fixing governance. Of course, those were our guest, energy expert Ruse Moleshe, as well as Dr. Trevor Ngwane, speaking about the reality on the ground of Eskom giving itself that deadline between 12 to 18 months to end load reduction. Thank you for your time.